Good day, dear viewers. We are here with Dr. Michelle Miller, esteemed psychologist and pioneer in online education, to have a lovely interactive session. But first, here's more about Dr. Miller. Dr. Michelle Miller serves as the esteemed professor of psychological sciences and distinguished teaching fellow at the Northern Arizona University. Dr. Miller, who graduated from the University of California, has an extremely reputable academic background in cognitive psychology. Her special interest is in attention and distance education. Dr. Miller co created lots of initiatives which have helped college students ease their college experience. She is the author of Minds Online Teaching Effectively with Technology, published by Harvard University. She's also written many scholarly articles which have caught the interest of popular magazines like The Conversation. She was also the main speaker in events hosted by Columbia, Harvard, and Tsinghua University. We, the Springdays School of Valor, are extremely honored to interview the renowned psychologist Dr. Michelle Denise Miller.
Hello, and thank you so much for that introduction. What an honor to be able to speak to your group today. And maybe we can celebrate that technology is what makes it possible. All right.
So, Neha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, ma'am. I'm Neha of ninth grade, and I'm a very curious person, always willing to know more and enhance my knowledge. When the administration offered me a chance to meet you, I was thrilled and immediately took up the opportunity. I would also like to welcome Priyanka, ma'am. She is an English professor at Springdays. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Right.
And you
Nice.
can go.
And I am Tarun Balaji, the representative of the next generation and aspiring psychologist.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. If I may ask a question of you, what areas of psychology are you interested in at this point?
The clinical partner.
Very important.
I came across Dr. Miller on a website called Speaker Hub, a website for speakers, and I was immediately intrigued by this word distance education. I thought, wasn't that something that was recently introduced during the pandemic? Well, no. It has been present for years, and psychologists like Dr. Miller have been researching education and distance education in particular for years. So I immediately sent her an email, and we were extremely thrilled when she replied to us. Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us your time and for considering us. Without any further ado, here we have Dr. Michelle Miller.
All right. So thank you again for that introduction, and what a good point that is. That we're seeing unexpectedly distance and remote education and communication and projects of all kinds are being mediated now by technology in the way that they weren't before. But this is something that goes back so far. And in fact, in my book Minds Online, when I was thinking about how should I begin this topic, how should I write about this, it's always good to start from a personal perspective. And so I started that book by talking about how when I was a child, a very, which is a very long time ago, I had the pleasure of working with a computer that was very cutting edge at the time. Nobody had computers, and we had one that we had access to in our school, and it was called Plato. It had a touch screen, which was very unusual at the time as well. And I used it to try to learn math and so on. And I wish that I could have had more time with it. And now here we are in this world today where you can do almost anything online, including your education.
So, Dr. Miller, to start things off, you know very well about the current crisis we are in. Due to the COVID 19 pandemic, we have the seemingly never ending lockdown in most parts of the world. That means no vacations, no entertainment, and most importantly, no face to face learning. We have shifted bases to online education. Students are facing this huge expectations to excel in online classes. So, what would be your tips to the student community watching this, man?
Yes. what many of experts have pointed out, and this might seem a little evasive, but this is what we have said, is that we've said, what we see right now is not really what we conceive of when we conceive of really, well-designed online education, which has two important things that we don't have right now. Number one, a lot of time and training to set up, beginning to end, how a course will unfold in this new kind of environment where we're usually not even in the same kind of working together in the same time frame. And things take place online. The other thing that we don't have right now is that, in the past, learners have opted in. They've said, oh, I want to do online high school, which has been something that some students have chosen before now in the United States. And college students saying, I really would like to be able to do a very flexible college degree that fits around my childcare and my work and everything else. And so I'm volunteering to do this. Or maybe I just want to take one online course, but do the rest of my education in person. And that's not the case now. We all have to do this. So I think kind of recognizing this, and I hope that students of today will not come away thinking that what they're experiencing right now is typical of the very best that online education can do. In particular, we've usually emphasized the kind of online education that doesn't have as much kind of same time, same place, Zoom meeting type of interaction. I think that those interactions are wonderful, and we're having a wonderful one right now. But they're not very flexible, right? That in online education, that's the big thing, is flexibility, and it's very personalized. And this tends to be very lockstep. So give it a chance in another form after we've come through this. So I think some other tips for students. The first thing is to really dig when you're not in the Zoom meeting, when you have your readings or your assignments. I think it is especially important to use very powerful techniques for studying. And a lot of those most powerful techniques, as you may know by now, involve getting actively engaged, right? When we just read information, it doesn't tend to really stick, or the teacher just talks about it, doesn't really tend to stick. It's on us to read it and to say, okay, close the book. What did I just understand about this? Or another technique that many people have advised to students is when they're feeling like I'm lost, I don't understand this, is to see if you can teach it to somebody else. And that could, it doesn't have to be formal. That could be explaining it to your grandmother or your younger sister or brother who's home with you. Some students even say, oh, I taught it to my pet fish. Because the whole point is to say, how can I explain this? And once you do that, you'll start to really gain some purchase on that information. I think another thing is to communicate. This is something that for faculty on the other side, I've said, no matter what you do, talk to your students. Tell them, even if I don't have this lesson finished, or I'm not sure what we're doing next week, let them know where we're at right now and what's expected. And so for students to always keep those lines of communication open as well. If you're lost, tell your teacher. Sometimes even when we get an email or a message that says, I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to try to get back on track, we respond. But the more specific you can be, the better. If you can say, well, I understood this part of the lesson, but this material, here's what I don't understand, then we can do better. And sometimes because we're already on Zoom, we can say, it's easier to just explain. Let's take 10 minutes and you and I will talk together. So I think that those are two of the key things that students can do to keep themselves moving forward, even though this is a very challenging environment.
Here we have your second question.
All of us have some sort of inspiration or booster that keeps us going, that motivates us to accomplish something in life, something big. What was your booster, ma'am?
Oh, wow, what a great question. Oh my gosh. Let me think for a moment. There've been so many. I think recently, just really in the last few years of my career, the opportunity to talk to my fellow faculty about teaching. In higher education, we do so many things. People may assume that it's all about teaching the classes, but for many faculty, teaching classes is only one thing in there, and a very complex job where they're expected to do research and administer programs. And it's very easy for teaching to slip down, and they never get a chance to sit with somebody else who's not there to judge them and say, oh, you have to do this way or that way, but to say, isn't teaching amazing, and how can we do it better? And so I'm able to sometimes come in if I'm a guest speaker, or if I'm, even doing something on my own campus with a program, to say, okay, forget about everything else for the next hour. We're just here to talk about the teaching and the students, and seeing the inspiration kind of on their faces and hearing it in their voices to say, oh, that's what I could do differently. And I have a creative way to apply these ideas, and I'm going to do this tomorrow. That is very, very rewarding. And being able to, as I've been able to do lately, to feel like, oh, I started out just working with 5 people or 10 people at my own school, whoever would agree to come and have lunch and listen, and but now I can write an article and reach 10,000. I can reach 20,000 sometimes if it's a very successful article. And then I think about how many students each one of those faculty have. It's sort of a math problem, and that is a big effect, like a ripple in a pond. So that's been a very big one. And, going back even a little bit further, I've just always been fascinated by the science of psychology. And, there are lots of areas of psychology that I love, even though they're not my particular area I study right now. Social psychology, clinical psychology. I read these findings that come out of these fields, and I go, wow, they're doing great things. So I have loved this field ever since I was a teenager. And just the ability to take a scientific view of what goes on in the mind. One of the most mysterious things that we've ever seen as human beings is the mind and the brain. To figure things out scientifically and be able to really give people some advice about how to live better based on that is also very inspirational to me.
This lockdown has brought about lots of changes. More specifically, less peer interaction, entertainment, and a lack of regular routine, ma'am. This is causing lots of distress and depression, especially in teens. What do you think the teens of today can do to mitigate stress, ma'am?
Oh, good question. Now, I, as a psychologist, I have to say, I'm not a clinical psychologist or a medical doctor, so take that advice that way. But at the same time, I think we teachers have to think about stress. We have to think about students' well-being in a way. You can't learn if you're not, if you can't feel motivated, if you're not physically and mentally healthy. So I think some great advice that does come out of psychology research, forgive me if this sounds too simple, but it's a very powerful thing, is the power of physical activity. Now, for those who have health challenges right now or other limitations, this may not even be a possibility, but we know from so much research that our brains are made more healthy, our moods are improved through something that costs very little or nothing at all, and other than a little bit of time, and has almost no bad side effects. So whatever physical activity you are, and we don't want to worry about like, oh, should I do this? Is this exercise perfect, or how many minutes per week? Just get out there and move. If there's somebody in your household, I know in my household, we have several young adults and teenagers who are all here in the household. We try to get together, and we have certain online workouts that we like very much. We'll do an intensive yoga for an hour together. That's social, and we're moving. We might take a walk together. We have dogs, so our dogs benefit from that as well. Being in the outdoors, if the weather is okay, pretty much anywhere, whether it's a walk through a city or a walk through a natural area, it's very COVID safe, and it's a very positive thing to do. So really looking and saying, where is the physical activity coming? That will physically improve my mood and my brain. And I think as well, teenagers and young adults throughout the ages have found ways to connect with each other, even when they were separated by time, space, conflicts that were going on. young people have incredible creativity. So while it's no replacement, and while we all know that there are some downsides to things like social media, really reflecting and saying, what is positive? When have I used social media and felt good at the end? Was it when I reviewed some videos that made me laugh? Was it when I set a time to talk to a friend? Those who are privileged enough to have access to the technology, maybe you can even combine it and say, I'm going to go for a walk on my side of town, you go for a walk on your side of town, we'll talk together. So doing everything we can to keep the positive social connections in our world as well. And then I guess lastly, for those who are living in multi-generational households where there's parents, grandparents, younger siblings, I know that in our household, we always find it very, very rewarding to say, how can I help somebody else? How maybe we could start a project together. Maybe there's a repair that needs to be done in the home, or maybe the parents could get a break if we cooked the dinner one night, did something like that. Helping others, if it has to be in our immediate household, that's fine. Or maybe there's a friend that we can reach out to and say, hey, how have you been doing lately? We also know from a lot of research that that's something that tends to improve well-being, is when we feel like we are also helping others.
What gave you the idea of writing and publishing your own book, ma'am? Was it something you always wanted to do? How did that idea strike you, ma'am?
Oh, writing a book. Yes, I'm so pleased you asked. It's I would say yes. I don't know if I always would have admitted that. I'm an avid book reader. I like to read books about my profession, and I also read a lot of nonfiction books and a few fiction books too. So I've always kind of been a fan. I'm like the person who watches the sport from the sidelines, but never actually gets out there and plays. And here's the thing too, in psychology, our formal research that we do, that we're expected to do as part of our jobs, books are not primarily what psychologists have written. We're expected to write research articles that are shorter and more data oriented. And I've done lots of that, and that was fine. But yeah, there was always almost this little unmet need that said, hey, maybe you can write some things that are not quite so technical, that actually get information out there. And so I guess the real beginning was being able to write an article back in, I think it was 2011, that distilled some research about memory for an audience of teachers. And it was kind of scary because I had no original data. I was just talking about what other people had done. But that article got more readers than I've ever gotten for an academic article. And people actually said it was useful. And that was very rewarding. But it is very hard to break into book writing. At least I found it so. It's just such a big project, and I didn't know about the different publishers and how it all works. So I was very fortunate to have a kind of a fan of my work, who's a very esteemed teacher and advice giver of his own. And he, I think he worked behind the scenes, and he just put me in contact with his publisher and his editor. That editor called me. So in a way, it kind of came to me, but it only worked because I was prepared. I had been working with so many different ideas. So when this person called me out of nowhere and said, okay, you have to tell me right now, do you have ideas for a book you could write? I said, you know what? I actually do. And I had listed out, and I said, I have 3, you can pick from them. And so by being prepared for that opportunity, when it came, I was able to put together a proposal and actually write the book. Now, about the middle of writing a book is not a pleasant place to be. You really and you have to work on it every day. It's not the kind of project that you can just say, well, let's do it in a year, I'll do it. No, everybody knows that's not realistic. So I just worked on it consistently and went through the process. And now I'm writing another book that just went to some reviewers. They're going to read it and tell me what they think. So I'm trying not to worry about it right now. But
Sure,
yeah,
ma'am.
having done it once, it was easier to do it a second time.
Another question about your book, ma'am. Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology. What were some of the most interesting and surprising things you discovered while writing your book, ma'am?
Oh, interesting and surprising things. Wow, that's great stuff because, and you're right, you have to review so much research. You go into it saying, well, I'm going to write this book because I know about this area, but then you realize you don't know everything about the area. Surprising things. I learned a lot about, strangely enough, about making things accessible to individuals who have, say, they can't see as well or they can't hear as well, how we can do that and why that is important to do. That was interesting. I also learned some more about memory. Memory research is an area that I find very relevant, and I try to stay on top of it. But there are thousands of articles that get written about memory every single year. I came to the realization that no one person can know it all, but I was able to learn a few new interesting things too. And I learned a lot about, I had to kind of establish for readers in the beginning that online education was even important or relevant and wasn't going to go away anytime soon. My editors just said, look, there are people who don't really know or accept this. So I had to go in and say, all right, what research has been done just on like how many students in my country even take an online course? That was information I had to look up and research and find out. So that was all, I think, real important stuff that I learned about.
How can we impart social emotional learning through online education, ma'am? This question comes from the premise that social emotional learning happens through experiential learning. In online education, what is the scope for such learning, ma'am?
Well, that's sort of another area that's a little bit outside of my expertise as a cognitive psychologist, but at the same time, I realized you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. So social and emotional learning. I think that while we probably cannot completely recreate the experience of being in a group, just like, watching a movie at home is never the same as going and seeing it in a theater. Listening to music over your headphones is never the same as going to a big concert. But we can try to boil down some things that do tend to trigger social and emotional connection. Now, one very basic thing is that human beings are very visual in general. We tend to be. So sometimes seeing a video or something that's actually happening can trigger, more engagement than reading about it for some people. I think getting students to work together to understand the material is also important too. And that's always important because of active learning, right? We have to get engaged in order to learn. But I think that that's a way, we can develop friendships online, but in classes, I think teachers are always saying, well, how do we make all the students friends with each other? Well, that's not always the point in a classroom or even a professional setting. Sometimes working well on a project together and making sure that students are getting along as they work on those projects can be a very satisfying way of forming those connections. I know for me, some of the people that I've had connections to for years, that's how we started out. We worked as students on projects, or we worked together to create something. So having that, and then I guess just having being open to a lighthearted atmosphere in class. So things like trivia facts, or some professors have students choose music to start each class with or to listen to as they're working on things, and that could be nice as well. So those are some ideas. Now I would also direct people. There's a brilliant psychologist who's writing in this area. I'm actually going to put this in chat. I'll put her name, Sarah Rose Kavanaugh. She is a real superstar right now. She's a teaching expert. She's a psychologist, but her area is emotion. She wrote a book called The Spark of Learning that I think many people are really going back to now to say, okay, how do I find some things? And you can tell from the title, that idea of emotions and connections as a spark that helps make learning easier.
Online school is definitely taking a toll on our concentration levels. I know that most of us have difficulty retaining information. So, how do we stay focused during a 1 hour long lecture, ma'am?
Right. Yeah. And that connection between attention and memory is one of the things and memory and learning is one of the most critical things that I've tried to stress for teachers as well. And it's funny because historically, there hasn't been much talk of attention in books and articles about how to teach better. The idea is like, oh, well, students will just stop paying attention after a certain number of minutes or something like that. And I think that we really do need to think about that. Now, how to stay focused. One of the things we have to realize that our minds are not set up to just sort of take in information passively minute after minute. And in fact, if you do want to keep people attentive for long periods of times, you have to do something like create a feature film. I mean, think of the millions of dollars that go into a film that is enough to keep your attention for an hour. Or video games. Again, millions of dollars go into video game design. Those things can keep us occupied, but in general, we're not that great at it. I think that first of all, reflecting as you're kind of doing by asking the question to say, okay, what tends to trigger me to feel less attentive or more attentive? Where is my attention level? And just realizing that you do have to be attentive, or you may as well not be in the lecture in the first place. It's important to respond now, or to create opportunities to respond. Now, think here about like a factory worker who's watching things go down the line and they just have to passively watch all day. They're not going to pay attention. But if they have to do something, they're going to pay attention. Now, good lecturers and good online lecturers will kind of break things up. They'll say, every 5 to 10 minutes is a good amount to say, okay, class, what do you think about this? Or, hey, let's do something different. I'm going to ask everybody a question or give a quiz. That will naturally refresh attention. However, what if your lecturer is not doing that? Then I think even something like taking notes, even if you don't need the notes later, that helps you kind of have something to do that is connected to the lecture. And you know what? Here's another place where I'm going to drop another book recommendation in the chat. It's called Simply Distracted, and it's by the brilliant teacher James Lang. And this is actually a book that it's a commercial book. It's not just for teachers, or it's not a textbook. It's a short book, and it talks about how students throughout the ages have struggled with distraction. It may be worse now, but he's an English professor and a historian. And so it's also good to have some perspective here to say that this is not something that just happened. He can go back, and 500 years ago, you have poets and scholars saying, how do I pay attention when somebody's playing the flute outside of my door? Now, granted, our distractions are much worse, but that kind of shows that complex interplay about attention. So reflection, finding ways to keep yourself actively engaged, even if the teacher isn't doing that, and even standing and stretching. If you can take a short walk, especially an outdoor walk between attention demanding activities, that's helpful. Drinking a lot of water, making sure you feel physically refreshed is also a small thing that you can do.
You continue to be a major inspiration for all of us, ma'am. But who was your inspiration, your role model? Who was that person who you always were in the awe of, ma'am?
Oh my gosh. Oh, what a great question as well. I will have to cite a few individuals. I mean, of course, we have our teachers, right, who inspired us to go on and continue. I had some great ones in my college education. I'll credit Dr. Richard Lewis was one of my favorite undergraduate teachers. He's a neuropsychologist. And just, you never knew what was going to happen when you came to class. And he treated us all with such respect and such engagement. And he's just a really funny he has a great personality too. So there is that. I think my professional inspirations, well, James Lang, I remember reading his columns when I was a young faculty member myself. He writes for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I would just, every time he had a new column, I would read it at lunch and try to follow his advice. Now, in the field of cognitive psychology, there's so many towering figures who, like you said, I'm in awe of. One who is, I know he's a controversial figure these days because of some of his, social and political views, but I don't care, is a professor named Steven Pinker. Now, Steven Pinker wrote a number of books. He's written, many books about different aspects of cognitive psychology, especially language, which I did a lot of work on as a graduate student. He wrote a classic book called The Language Instinct Yes, I'll break that down too. Instinct. And he's also written recently at least one book about writing itself. And his way of bringing humor and popular culture and just a beautiful sense of kind of rhythm and beauty in his writing, and using that to explain these really complicated things that go on in our minds. Things like language, which we use every day and we don't think about that much, but it's incredibly complex. I mean, if I could write like anybody, I would write like Steven Pinker. So he was a real inspiration to say, you know what? You can do both. You can be a researcher and you can bring your ideas to people outside of your narrow field. You can bring, a sense of wonder and awe and humor to the most technical subjects. So he's been a real inspiration as well. And I'll also list my extremely brilliant and still working graduate advisor, Dr. Donald Mackay. And Dr. Mackay is just his mind works like nobody else's that I've ever met in the world. He's kind. He's quirky. He's just unbelievably brilliant and creative. And he took me in as a graduate student and listened to my ideas and gave me his ideas, and also just encouraged me to be creative and to never stop learning. So yeah, those are the folks.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. So, psychology is a readily upcoming field, cognitive psychology in particular. What are some pieces of advice you have for those interested in venturing into the vast field of cognitive psychology?
Okay. So, good question. I think really being aware of the different kind of career paths you can use. I mean, it's great to study a field just because you intellectually love it, and I think if you do that, you'll succeed at something. But it's also really good to be thinking about the fact that cognitive psychologists work in many settings, and to be thinking about and maybe experimenting, what kind of settings do I like to work in? Here's one in particular that I've noticed that students in the United States are not often aware of, and that is the field of instructional design, right? And I'll mention to students, hey, have you thought about going into instructional design? And they say, what is that? Well, it is the ability to, and it's a field where you take cognitive psychology and other learning sciences as well. So educational psychology, you draw from many fields, and you use that to, you combine it with technical knowledge to then be an expert to help create courses, to set up online courses, and to assist faculty. Instructional designers are becoming very important these days. So, for example, I do some online workshops for faculty, and one of the things that I do that the company gives me is an instructional designer to work with. And I can communicate with her in terms that we both understand. We speak the same language in a way, but she knows more about the technology and I know more about the content. So that's a field. So kind of thinking about that. Cognitive psychologists work sometimes in corporations as consultants. They even sometimes are trial consultants in the United States, where we have many legal trials, and they serve as expert witnesses. And then you have the more traditional field of doing research and teaching in a university setting, which for some of us is exactly the right thing. So really thinking about that. So getting as much research experience as possible. That's true of any field, but especially in a research intensive one like cognitive psychology. So finding a faculty member or somebody you can work with who can kind of teach you how to set up a study, how to analyze the data. We use a few very specific techniques that you don't see in some other areas of psychology, and they're not that difficult to master, but it's good to get that experience. And then I guess as in any field of psychology, really getting a sense of what the current theories and the current research interests are, since there's so many questions out there. So saying, how do I even subdivide it further so that if somebody says, hey, what are you interested in studying? You want to work in my lab? What are you interested in? To be able to address that in the terms that we would use.
Yes, ma'am.
What is one incident that has taught you a lot, ma'am? Something that has changed the way you look at the world? Or something that is close to your heart that has taught you a very important lesson, ma'am?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think for that type of question, I would go with being a parent. I have three children who are, they range between 14 and 24 years old. And we had our first child when I was just still in graduate school. So it's been a very, a very big part of my life. And I think very few people on earth could say that they were not transformed by parenthood. But it's really and especially for psychologists, it's one thing to read about development or language or something in a textbook. It's another to see it coming up in this child who's absolutely unique. And then for those of us who have multiple children, you get to see how the children are different too. So that's a very inspirational thing. And I think, like many parents too, we think about it gives an urgency to what we do. We do our best work because we know that we are contributing to a world that is going to be handed down to our children, and that may be very abstract before you have your own children, but it becomes very concrete once you do. So that has really been quite a journey. And there's other basic things like it. As a scholar, you have to really organize your own work. You don't have a supervisor who's in and saying, "Oh, this is what you have to do in the next 5 minutes." You have to manage yourself. And when you're a parent, you learn to manage so many additional responsibilities. In a way, it makes you so much more organized. Which is not that people without children are also typically, many of them are very, very organized, but you really, really learn. So I think it made me more productive in a way. It taught me, for example, that I have to sit down. If I'm going to write a book, I have to find a time and I have to work on it every day. I'm not going to be able to just say, "Oh, I'll spend a week or two on it later on," because I have people depending on me that need other things. So that's been a very great experience that is transformative.
Yes, ma'am.
These online classes are certainly a new experience for most people watching this. But you have been a pioneer in this field, ma'am. So, what you would be the best person to give us your opinion. What do you like most about online learning, ma'am? What makes it better or worse, in your opinion, from face to face learning?
Oh, great question. So, and sometimes I think it's just different. It's just a different thing than a more traditional environment. I think what I like best about it is the avenues for creativity, really. And again, right now we don't always get to exercise our creativity. We're all trying to manage in a very difficult environment. But when we do have time to plan one of these courses, um, suddenly all the old rules go out the window. We don't have to schedule things at a set time anymore. We don't have to say, well, how many people will fit in a class? Or, for example, in a face-to-face class I taught last year, we ended up having an online component. And it was getting guest speakers, much as we're like doing here today. It occurred to me that I could simply ask some of my contacts. The class, by the way, was teaching beginning graduate students how to teach. It was a fun, what a wonderful thing to teach. Well, I could just put out a call to say, well, maybe these experts in teaching can just come and be a guest speaker for 30 minutes in the class. And it worked so incredibly well. And that we could do in an online class. But I had to be creative and say, well, wait a minute, maybe not all speakers have to be physical. Maybe we can interface with people who are outside of the classroom. So I think that that's a big part of it. And online teaching forces you to be creative too. So we have to say things like, well, if we're not going to sit in a circle of chairs and discuss what we thought about the readings, then how are we going to discuss it? And so, for example, I've really explored using so-called collaborative annotation tools. I use one that's called Perusall, but there's lots of others out there. So basically, students, instead of all reading their own books and making their own notes, they read the chapters of the book, but they make comments that other people can see, and they can tag each other. They can tag me if they have a question. They don't have to wait until the next class. They can just say right away, "Dr. Miller, this, I disagree with this, or I don't understand what this term means. Can you say something, or what's your opinion on this?" Works a little bit like social media in that way, using our familiar tools. So that's something that it just opens up all sorts of things. And now I even use that again in face-to-face classes because I liked it so much using it online. So I think that sense of possibility is what's really wonderful.
We have some rapid fire questions for you, ma'am. The first question: is there a quote that motivates you every day that you would like to share with us, ma'am?
Oh my goodness, a quote that motivates me. Well, I can share one that's on my social media. It's a little strange, but and I hope you won't take it the wrong way. But it was made by sort of a comedian called Kinky Friedman, who's a guy from Texas, where I've lived before. Kinky Friedman said, "Find what you love and let it kill you." And again, don't take it the wrong way, but it's just like you have one life. Find what inspires you, and don't worry about what it does. We all have only the time we have. Pour it into things you love.
Yes, ma'am. Tarun, you can go up with the second question.
If you had to describe yourself in one word, what would that be, ma'am?
Well, it might be impossible. This is why I find Twitter so difficult. It's like I can't even say hello in 420 characters. If I had to describe, I would say inquisitive. I always want to know.
Yes, ma'am.
Online learning or face to face learning? If you have to choose one, ma'am.
Oh, I got to go with online. It's changing the world.
Talent or persistence? Which one would you prefer?
Oh, persistence. Yes. Any educator would say persistence eats talent for lunch.
What would be your worst nightmare, ma'am? Not being an author or not being a professor?
Oh, wow. That's a good. I think not being an author. I think not being an author. Now that I've been able to do this, I don't think I'd give it up if for anything.
Michelle Miller, the professor, Michelle Miller, the author, Michelle Miller, the psychologist. Which one would you prefer, ma'am?
I think I'm going to be consistent and go with the author.
If you have to time travel and met yourself when you were a teenager, what would you tell yourself who's 14 years old, ma'am?
Oh, I think like with most middle-aged people, I would say to her, just hang in there. Don't worry so much, and things are gonna work out well. I would probably I would tell her, well, 14-year-old me was also pretty hardworking and so on, but I would tell her to not get so stressed out about school, but to really focus on the learning. There's some things that I wished I'd learned a little bit more strongly back then that I could use now.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, we have a question from one of our teachers at our school, ma'am. We follow Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence based teaching pedagogies in our school. Can technology cater to any type of learner, for example, a kinesthetic learner, tactile learner, spatial learner, etc.? Or would there be a particular type of learner who would benefit more?
Rather than try to focus on those ideas, although I do want to say that's really great that to be considering the diversity of learners is a huge advantage to creating really good teaching in any modality. I would say that probably a bigger determinant, and I'm speculating here, but probably a bigger determinant of who's going to be successful in online learning is not necessarily so much, things like tactile or visual. I think everybody learns better when we have some blend of those. Most of us are very engaged by the visual. Most of us remember very well when we actually physically carry out an action. But there's more kind of social and personality characteristics. For example, some students are highly introverted. And those are the students who are probably going to have a much easier time with online learning, not so much because of the cognitive or sensory aspects of it, but just because they're much more comfortable doing their own thing, and they may actually find it a little less stressful than being in a room full of other people their age. Extroverted students are going to have a pretty difficult time. Those are the people who get their energy from other people, and they're going to feel very tired and very distracted when they're learning. So I do think that continuing to dig into, what makes learners different, what makes learners diverse, how do we incorporate as many people as possible is probably a good avenue for reflection. But don't worry quite so much about the tactile, visual, kinesthetic, and so on. I think that that's great as an overarching framework. I don't know that it necessarily may help us teach online in these circumstances better, but maybe somebody will prove me wrong. We'll see.
For me, the most impactful idea that ma'am told was helping others and fitness. Sitting at home and being healthy is a difficult job, but one should be consistent about one's mental and as well as physical health. It was such a pleasure talking to you, ma'am. I'm grateful for interviewing with you today, ma'am. You have given me a clear overview. Thank you so much for being with us today in spite of a busy schedule, ma'am. Gratitude is the most beautiful way to express that's all in your heart with just 2 words. Thank you. Once again, thank you so much for being with us today, ma'am.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was my pleasure. What a joy to have contact with students who are with such energy and devotion. And please feel free to get back in touch and let me know how you're doing.
Sure, ma'am.